We've been experiencing, along with the sexual abuse revelations, almost a weekly mass shooting by men, by men, exclusively men. That never comes up in the conversation. When people always discuss this in cultures, it's sort of like, what influence do video games have on this? What influence does the music have on it, or religious upbringing, or lack of religious upbringing, or whatever? I mean, but it seems to me that they're kind of missing the larger point. It just strikes me that when you have a phenomenon at this level, where 90% of all murder convictions are men in this country, and that statistic plays out all across the planet, then why aren't we talking about that? Why isn't that relevant, at least in the analysis? Or it isn't one of the first things we leap to when we discuss these things. If all these people were left-handed, if they had this one common strength, we'd be investing billions of dollars to try and figure out why left-handed people are so crazy and dangerous. And we don't. And I think, this kind of intentional blindness that we have also speaks to the whole issue that we're talking about, this kind of surprise that sexual misconduct, as it's being gently called, or assault or abuse is caught us by surprise. In point of fact, actually, we haven't talked about this. We not only talk about it, we don't even think about it. It's never even part of the calculus when these things occur. So I don't have an answer. I just simply was saying we're not even asking the question.
This is my home. Northampton, Massachusetts is a small progressive city with a large queer community and politically active population. Smith College is an all-women's school that overlooks downtown and has a significant impact on our local culture. When I was younger, I was taught I could do anything a boy could do. Female empowerment was instilled in me from a young age. Yet something was missing from the picture. Where were the boys? Where were the men? They were hardly ever part of the conversation, and it seemed like while I was taught to engage with feminism, boys learned to watch and stay silent. I wanted to know what Northampton is teaching boys about masculinity. Is my town giving them the tools to rewrite their gender roles? Over my last year of high school, I sat down with 14 Northampton community members to ask them my questions about their experiences with masculinity.
I've had situations where I've dealt with people and I've tried to keep everything bottled up, but I've, broken and gotten really mad and blacked out, with my grandma, since she's the one who's raised me. It comes up with her a lot, if she ever sees me crying at home, or if she sees me that I'm feeling really depressed, she always tells me, "You're a man, suck it up."
For the first year I was out, I was hyper masculine, and I needed to dress and look a certain way and act a certain way and not feel anything and be rude to females and just be a jerk and be hyper masculine. I didn't do anything female. Toxic masculinity is one of the biggest things in the community, and it's this: as soon as you come out, you need to be a macho man and do all these things that are considered masculine. So for a while, I would just hide all my feelings because men don't have feelings, and I was really mean to people because I thought I was supposed to treat women horribly. I mean, I've watched people literally lose friends and family because they think they need to be this big macho man and they need to hide their feelings and not address things when things are wrong, which can lead to really bad mental health and abuse.
I've done some therapy on anger management, and it's been moderately successful. In fact, I discovered a couple of years ago that I get very angry in defense of other people, and that seems to be probably displaced. Powerlessness, I think, produces a lot of anger, or feeling that you're powerless. And I remember I get so annoyed with my dad annoyed is putting it mildly. I get so annoyed when it came time to cut the lawn. I thought about doing it in a swastika because he's he's Jewish, and I never did it though.
In terms of depression and suicide and those kinds of issues, I think part of that's toxicity, right? If I'm not allowed to detox of sorts, then that builds up, right? So there's those intrapersonal things, those individual pieces where men do have higher rates of suicide, although women actually attempt suicide at higher rates. So men use more lethal methods. We have higher rates of addiction. We're risk takers. The more that men buy into kind of traditional notions of masculinity, the more likely they are to have worse health outcomes. So they are less likely to use health services of any sort, including mental health services. They're more likely to take risks with their own and other people's health. So that includes things like less likely to wear everything from seatbelts to condoms, which puts other people at risk, and are more likely to engage in violence.
Men are more likely to rely on women for their source of emotional support. And if you're talking about married men, they're more likely to rely solely on their wives as their social support, whereas women usually have networks that they rely on. So there's also the statistics that show that men die younger than women. Women are more likely to get sick, but they live longer. And they're more likely to seek out help. If we teach men that the only acceptable emotion is anger, and we don't allow them to express the whole range, they don't have many resources when they get frustrated. They go to anger, and that's about it. Plus, in our media, telling them that it's okay to be violent, it's acceptable to be violent.
When you start to watch that stuff a lot, especially at a young age, you find yourself almost replicating certain things that they do, not realizing that it's bad. You shouldn't be doing it. It's just not a smart thing to do. And I think certain social groups that don't realize that will just totally fall into what a hyper-masculine, whatever should be, only because of stuff they grew up on.
I'm not saying that boy men have it tough. This isn't an anti-feminist comment. This isn't a men's movement perspective. This is observing that it's not that men are all jerks because they're born that way. They become that in relationships because the culture encourages them to shut down a natural and necessary part of the human existence, which is emotions. The full range of emotions, not just the acceptable ones.
You have to be carefully taught to be racist, to be sexist. You have to be taught to be hateful. And a lot of men, if not all, are encouraged to be and bullied into being slightly or a lot misogynist.
Little boys don't like to be hurt, just like little girls don't like to be hurt. I mean, if you have any experience at all with little kids, you see little boys and little girls are exactly the same. They don't like to be hurt, and they don't like to hurt other people. They really don't. So there's something that happens in their boys' socialization that makes that more acceptable.
Northampton is predominantly white, so I wanted to understand how whiteness and masculinity intersect. I wanted to look at how race impacts masculinity. What happens when multiple forms of privilege are combined? What does white masculinity look like in comparison to black masculinity or Asian American masculinity?
I know for me, my culture specifically, it's not talked about a lot. It's kind of just you have it and you have to go with it. You're a man. You didn't get to choose to be a man. That's it. Enough said. Let's keep going.
Because it is a predominantly white area, at least Northampton, right, is. And so we are talking about a particular type of masculinity. And I think that sometimes that combined with that sort of more, we're progressive ideal leads to a certain level of privilege that goes unaddressed.
I think that the Northampton can be racist in ways that it just doesn't even understand. It's totally unconscious of. The people trying the hardest not to be racist end up, to me, being racist. If they actually would stop and take a breath and look at their behavior, they would recognize that that they're engaged in a kind of reverse or triple reverse or quadruple reverse racism. And I think it's a hard time to be a white male. You have a president that's really just a horrible role model and just a terrible human being. You have people like Harvey Weinstein. And so as a white man, you're hearing all the time about white men and their misbehavior. And you just, if you're me, you're thinking, I don't misbehave. I try very hard to behave. I work very hard to be a good person. But when you keep hearing that white men are dominant and oppressive, it gets, I think that I can understand the angry white man thing. I have more consciousness. I have more therapy. I have more privileges than a lot of white men. But if you keep hearing that and you don't feel that applies to you, you become a separate and distinct group that's fueled by anger. And I understand that as a white man, I have a lot of privileges. But I actually have privileges. There are white men who, if you grow up in a trailer park, you're staying in the trailer park. Studies will show that. So if you're born poor, you stay poor. And I'm not saying that you don't have privileges as a white man, even so. But if you're hearing that you're the master class, it can be a little dissonant with your reality. And there, I think, becomes the germ of a lot of anger.
I became aware at an earlier age that there was a responsibility that comes with being a white male. There is a responsibility because I am of the cohort, the identified cohort, that runs things, that owns things. I trended more towards what was being defined as the feminine progressive side because I thought that I really don't think that's a healthy attitude. I think it's corrosive and destructive, and it functionally eliminates about 3/4 of the people who live and breathe on this planet. And directly responsible for most of the violence that's perpetrated in this planet. When I say most, I'm saying 80 to 90% of all violent acts are committed by men, and not just white men. And irrespective of religions, irrespective of culture, irrespective of upbringing, it's this throughout the globe. So what accounts for that? And we're not even at the point where we address those issues. That's what worries me. We're not at that point and discuss how that phenomenon occurs. That is a phenomenon where men are responsible for violence and many of the woes that exist within our culture, and we don't own it. My struggle as a white male is defined by my, well, I suppose shame, for my cohort, my gender, and my embarrassment and my culpability. So I think I have to own some of this.
Throughout the making of this film, men spoke about the language used against them to discipline them and reinforce cultural norms. Studying language can tell us a lot about who has power and where accountability is held. As culture shifts, how does language reflect or produce change?
Common insults back then would be faggot, pussy, queer. Those three were pretty prominent and a pretty much catch-all for not manly. I'm not sure if that's part of Northampton culture. I don't hear those words here in the high school that much.
We kind of live in a generation, or at least I see it, where it's like those words kind of lost their meaning, or at least since we're from Northampton and we're in a bubble, we don't see the actual effect those words can have on people. So like, is it okay if I say one of them, or is that too far? Like the word faggot, a lot of the times is associated with gay people, and I bet if you said it anywhere outside of Northampton, people would automatically assume you're trying to hurt a gay person's feelings. But in actuality, it's like people in this town feel like that word isn't associated with gays and it's more associated with like someone being lame. So like a lot of guys will just say it, like, oh, that guy's being a faggot, and he's just saying, oh, that guy's being lame. But if you didn't understand the context of that, then you'd think he's just being a homophobe.
I think we've seen a diminishing amount of that kind of insulting behavior. I think it still goes on. And there are definitely people whose consciousnesses have not been raised about this. I think the trajectory is a little encouraging, especially with all the, I mean, let's remember what's happened in the last 45 years. A gay rights movement, gay and lesbian rights movement, a transgender movement within the last 10 years of people saying enough is enough. Great example is the Pride March. I did it from the beginning, and there were people wearing paper bags on their head because they couldn't acknowledge their sexual orientation. Look how far we've come there. Just at the campus school, For the first bunch of years I marched with the campus school, I had to make my own banner. When I was told I couldn't represent the school, then they tolerated me making my own banners. The sixth graders would make a big banner and a bunch of them would march with me. Last year they had the campus school float. First time ever.
It's how we use our language. Professor Jackson Katz actually talks about this. He does a great TED Talk on it. How we neutralize people or genders or whomever, but simply by using language of passivity. So for instance, instead of what you will hear is a woman was raped. What's missing there is a woman was raped by a man, or a more clearly, a man raped a woman. That actually is the clear line of responsibility and actually expresses the crime, as opposed to presenting a victim who just sort of spontaneously was raped by no one or anything. We do that with gender all the time. We do that in our conversations just as a matter of course. We're not even aware of it when we think about it. And it's not just around issues of rape or sexual violence, but it's just how we deal with each other on the gender spectrum. You know, right now in our communities, we're struggling, and it's good that we're struggling to understand the difference between gender and sexuality. We're struggling to understand what it means to assign a pronoun to someone. And sometimes it's comical, but at the same time, it shows that at least there's an attempt.
Still, like, before I got here, I had to go to 4 different stores before I could find a bathroom because there's only one stall, and they always take up those stalls, so that's a privilege. I mean, obviously, they're viewed as man. If they say they're male, they're viewed that way, but some trans men aren't viewed that way for a while. The biggest thing is they're not aware of their privilege as men. And I'm hyper aware of my privilege because I lived the first 14 years as not a man. I think they're just raised a certain way, as where I had to learn how to be a man. They were just born that way, so they think they're doing the right thing, but really they're not. When cis men say, oh, you're just a man because you're a man, that's definitely their privilege showing because that's how just the world sees them. They don't have to fight to be seen that way.
Where are these messages being taught? They're being taught in every aspect of a boy's life. Yet many men pointed to the sports and athletic community as a place where these messages were extremely active. They explained that their coaches, teammates, and onlookers taught them how to express their masculinity.
I thought, these are people like awakened and sensitive people, but they still said terrible things. They still had completely inappropriate conversations. They asked inappropriate questions about relationships and sexual encounters with women. They made degrading comments about people they saw. And, in particular, I'm thinking of one in my mind where a friend of mine was, some distance away, a woman, and people I was with on my team said disgusting things about her. And I was angry about it, but said nothing. They were kind of senior to me, and I was afraid of that. I was afraid to stand up and say, that is horrible. And she's my friend, and I can't associate with that. I said nothing. They knew she was my friend, and one of them, after moments of sort of silence, said, she's a friend of yours, isn't she? And I just said, yes.
I was watching a Little League over here at the junior high school, JFK. They could get hit by a ball and they could cry and people would comfort them and take care of him and empathize with him, right? But right at the age of puberty, it was so interesting to watch. Suddenly, there was this whole collusion, unconscious collusion, that I'd watch a boy get hit really hard by a ball or something, and you'd see him wince, and then very quickly, well, I'm fine.
Like, I have a lot of friends who play sports. They almost have to fall into the category of being like, I'm a guy, I can do it myself, like I don't need anyone's help, which is like a really bad mindset, in my opinion. I feel like that can lead you into a lot of places where you can't ask for help when you really need it.
In an interview with Superintendent Provost, he started off and was like, I have a question for you. It's a bit awkward. I don't think I've ever had to ask a teacher this. And I was sitting there and I was like, oh no, what is the gap on my resume that he's seen? And he was like, how much do you bench? And we joked about that a little bit. And then later that day, I got a call from Kara Dupre, the athletic director here. And she said, I just talked to the superintendent, and he and I were thinking that we could maybe start a strength and conditioning club at the school, and you could, be in there after school to monitor the weight room. There are a lot of signs of masculinity. Here's how you behave in a weight room, right? This is marked off as a zone for men. Girls and women who want to be in this zone need to deal with that, rather than dudes need to deal with this. It should, in a lot of ways, be on the boys to change, rather than expectations of the girls to just fit in.
The NFL and football in general, college football and high school tackle football, is maleness gladiatorially expressed in ways that I think are super unhealthy. I stopped watching last year. I used to be a big Patriots fan. And there are things about football that I think are phenomenal, but destroying each other's bodies is certainly not one of them. So I would highlight sports, but really way more the contact sport of football is destructive, and maleness is celebrated there, and the military is celebrated. They'll flyovers with jets, and women are demeaned because they're still cheerleading in scant costume. There's a whole bunch of things wrong with that.
Masculinity is impacting our wider society, and many men spoke about how Trump's election and the Me Too movement shook them from their complicity in toxic masculinity and made them realize the gravity of this conversation.
And now we have the most caricatured persona of the damaged masculine in our president. I couldn't even imagine a more damaged, wounded, I call it, representation of the masculine. So it's kind of a big wake-up call.
But he's in the White House. 20 women now have accused him of sexual harassment or worse, and he's the president. So I'm very worried about that in terms of the model that's providing for young boys.
I'm finding my whole age group of men are completely flummoxed. They don't know what to do. They don't know how to address or react to this. Maybe in some level they were complicit in something similar, or they participated in something similar, or they've never heard this before, or it just seems completely bizarre. And why does it seem so pervasive? Despite the fact that women have been saying this for generations, this enormous sense of surprise, confusion, and despair.
Not all men, or well, but there's some really great things about masculinity. Okay. And the sun hopefully will come up tomorrow too. That's a truism as well, right? But how do we, for those of us who are male identified, how do we, rather than pushing it away, saying, all right, so what is my role in this? Yeah, you're right. There's some really problematic aspects to this, and how am I going to look at it, rather than saying, oh, there's some really problematic aspects. Yeah, those guys over there, they're horrible. I think it's a continuum. I think that there's a smaller number of men who are doing the really predatory things, but I also think that there's a much larger number of men who are participating in sexist behaviors that support the more violent behaviors. A couple weeks ago, people were talking a lot about Al Franken, right, and that pictures of him. There's somebody who's taken that picture. There are other men that were standing there egging him on. And so what are the ways that we, maybe not that overtly, but what are the other ways that we're standing by and not saying things?
Feminist scholars have talked about kind of a continuum of male violence, starting with the minor forms, which would be sexual harassment or catcalling, all the way up to killing partners. And they say it's on a continuum. It's all the same thing, but it's different versions. It's different levels of seriousness. It's different levels of acceptability in society. Girls are taught, you know, if a boy comes up and punches you in the arm, it means he likes you. And that's really sick, because that's kind of teaching little girls that to be hit means you're loved. So we have this whole thing that starts really early, where boys are allowed to be this way. In fact, they're not, they might be punished a little bit, but it's clearly an acceptable thing for them to be violent.
Education is at the core of successful activism. No one is born knowing all the terminology, all the analysis, all the history. So what are educators doing to teach boys, and how are they engaging them in activism? Teachers interact with the future of masculinity on a daily basis, so are they seeing any changes?
In classes here, in terms of participation, boys tend to raise their hand and overspeak. Girls tend to not. They'll only raise their hand when they know they're right, and even when they're right, they usually think they're wrong. Boys have the same sort of anxiety and pressures about getting things right, but they're unafraid, and that's because they enjoy privileges.
A lot of times, girls are more deferential to each other, and boys will just cut in.
The middle school, a whole bunch of kids had to walk out of that school to protest sexual harassment. Those are boys growing up in Northampton who haven't learned the things I was trying to teach. I have to hope and pray and believe that none of my 6th grade boys were doing that. I was greatly proud and relieved that some of my 6th grade girls were leading it.
I know of events at the middle school around this very same issue, much more overt. Bad enough that the girls in that school mobilized at the end of last year. I know there hasn't been a whole lot of response.
Because I have the shop classes and engineering classes, I sometimes will have a group of 22, 23 just guys in a room and no girls. And that's a nightmare, because you need, if there's no girls in the room, even if the guy's a little bit crude and whatever, he'll tighten it up a little bit if there's a couple females. The kids are still kids. There's still a lot of guys around here that are just like they were when I was a kid, but there's a lot more that are more open-minded to differences in people. And I think that's one thing with like a lot of manly guys. Their bravado and their machismo comes from insecurity rather than like being secure with themselves, and that's the worst. When like an insecure guy is more likely to be the one that starts the fight, or says something that's just completely out of line, or picks out the person's actual real weaknesses rather than just roasting them for whatever. So you don't see that quite as much around here. Here, I think it's just people are more accepting of the differences, so you don't have to prove yourself in whatever you're being as much. Whereas if you have these very specific gender roles, if you're not living up to it in your own head, you get insecure about it, and then you have to go out and prove yourself. And you have to prove yourself by fighting, or telling the grossest stories or the dirtiest jokes, or swearing the most out of all your friends, all that kind of stuff.
Not that I get many of them, but more lewd jokes coming from male students. That is one aspect of trying to be a man, is being able to control these boundaries of what is and is not acceptable in a certain context.
Do I see a difference in sort of how young men are raised now and how I was raised as a young man? It's hard for me to tell. I guess the fact that I'm even hesitating suggests that I'm not really seeing any difference. If there really was, I would be able to point to it clearly. I really want there to be. There is definitely a conversation happening around it, more so than I remember. But again, whether that's resulting in changes, it's hard to tell. I mean, like I said, I'm seeing a lot of the same behaviors that I identify as privileged and empowered and dominating and oppressive. They're on a small scale, but there's signs of what's to come. I guess no, I don't see a whole lot of growth in that area. Yeah, when I said what's to come, I was referring to the ways that boys dominate the culture and dominate women, girls in school. It's within their world. It's things like giving them a hard time in the hallways, not letting them go places. It's things like talking over them in class. That exact sort of same thing will happen in the workplace. But what can't happen here are some of the more serious transgressions, because it's a structured environment. They're younger people. They tend not to commit the more violent actions. Here's somebody who's getting away with stuff, knows he can do it, and enjoys that. This is someone who's going to be dangerous.
Families teach many masculine gender norms, which stay with men for years after they leave their homes. I sat down with parents to ask them what it's like to raise a child in Northampton. What are the messages and morals they are trying to instill in their children? And are they raising feminist boys? Or is gender equity still seen as a women's issue?
My father would, he would be a bit, he would lose his temper during inappropriate times, like during a game of bridge. He also never said sorry, never in his life, as far as I know. That was something I always observed that. So consequently, I tended to say sorry much too much. I guess it was because I was the youngest of 6. My mom's, she had 6 kids, and I was the last, and it was a bit of an accident. So she'd had 2 boys, 1 girl, and then 2 boys. So now she had 4 boys, 1 girl, and she really, really wanted to have another girl, if she was going to have anything at all. And so suddenly I was going to appear, and she very much wanted a girl, and she had, so when in my early years, I was dressed as a girl. So one of my earliest memories was being called a girl by some person. And I went, I'm a boy. And I think that's when my parents went, okay, that's it, enough of this nonsense.
What role do I play in the raising of the child, and especially relative to masculinity? I am their primary model of masculinity. I am the adult male in the home. The most impactful way that I can impact their sense of masculinity is by what kind of man I am for them and before them. How I interact with their mother, how I support and provide for them, and the views that I express. You know, no one will do it perfectly. I'm not the model that I want to be, not the model I wish I had growing up, and that's something to strive for. You know, that's the first example, and what they will then later emulate, and what they will respect, and what they will believe to be normal. Not just what they will try to be like, but they will understand that that is normal. Yeah, it's when you say it that way, it's a lot of high stakes.
I remember one story with my youngest son when he was about, I think he was about 5 or something, and we would talk every night before bed in a dark room. And I remember one night he said to me, it sounded like he was going to come out. You know, he's 5 years old. You can't come out when you're 5. But it sounded like he was going to come out. And he was like, Mom, I have to tell you something. And I said, what? And it took him forever to get it out. And he said, my favorite color is pink. And I was like, that's okay. Pink boys can like pink. And he was so relieved when I told him that. He was like, he was worried that that meant he was a girl. I was just surprised when I had my first kid, being here in Northampton, about how every gift that was given to us for him was blue, basically. And even if you'd go to the stores and try to get something that wasn't, it was really, really hard to find something that wasn't blue. And so everything was really gendered. There was such a press, such pressure from, even from, people my own age who should know better, to kind of typecast my little baby boy as being really super active and tough and things like that, instead of just being kind of, a baby.
If you want to be a good dad, forget about all those guy things you used to do. Forget about going and playing pool with your buddies every Tuesday night, because that's what you've been doing for the last 20 years. Forget about all that other stuff. A real man would stop their life and then take responsibility for his new life, which would be, having some kids or whatever it is. But I think that's a big part of manhood, is doing what you need to do regardless of how it affects you personally.
This gets to identity. I don't chiefly identify as a man, and I don't chiefly identify my daughter as a girl or a woman. I chiefly identify the people in my family as the Cody family. It's not about me against the world as a man, but my family comes first and will be defended as necessary, no matter what.
I was the one who stayed home and raised my son, while my wife, for the most part, was going on and getting her teaching degree and her writing degree. And so I stayed home with my kid, and I didn't have a job. A lot of time for introspection, a lot of time for thought about how we figured in the world and how I figured in as a parent. So I think to some degree that at least it continued to stimulate the thought, as opposed to just getting locked into, this isn't fair, I'm doing too much childcare or something like that kind of attitude.
My wife was talking to her friend, and she told me afterwards, she's like, oh yeah, Bob does most of the cooking at home. And she's like, oh really, is he good? I'm like, yeah, he's good. She's like, once in a while, there's misses, but most of the time he's good. And she's like, oh, do you tell him that it's not good? She's like, yeah, of course I'll tell him it's not good. She's like, oh, if I ever told her husband it wasn't good, like I don't think he'd ever cook for me again. Like, well, what the heck's that? Like how can you? Open, honest relationships are the best. And open, honest relationships usually need a certain breaking down of the barriers. My firstborn daughter and me, when my wife was pregnant, she didn't have a very nice pregnancy. So I had this 2.5-year-old that needed attention. So me and her became very, very, very close during that time, and we still are. And it's great. I don't know if I would have ever had the same kind of relationship I had with a son that I do with my daughter, because you have, as a guy, I guess you just by nature have a little extra protective feeling towards a daughter than you would have a boy. So when she was like 2.5, 3 years old, my daughter would love painting my nails. So I'd come to school with I'm a woodshop teacher, coming in with pink or green or blue or like just a rainbow of colors in my hand. At first I was a little bit like, oh, I should brush this off. Like, it looks kind of silly. And I was like, you know what, who cares? What does it matter? And I had a quick little story. There was a kid that came in, and he was a very macho young man. He would never do something like that. And he said, why are you letting your daughter paint your nails? I would never go out with pink fingernails. I'm like, I tell you what, if you had a niece or a younger sister and she painted your nails and you came to school and some girl came in and said, oh, why is your nails pink? And you said, oh, my sister or niece wanted to paint them, so I just let her. And I'm like, know what the response would be? Oh my God, that's so sweet. And exactly 2 minutes later, a girl came into the classroom and says to me, Melnick, why is your nails pink? I'm like, oh, my daughter wanted to paint them. I just let her. And she's like, oh my God, that's so cute. And I looked at him, I'm like, see?
Northampton is a microcosm of progressive society. In many ways, the future of politics and cultural norms start with a shift in communities like ours. Feminist theory, articulated from places like Smith College, often precede broader shifts in women's roles in society. We were one of the first places to have a pride parade, and recently towns like ours have been influencing the highest court in the land. With this trajectory, what is the future of masculinity in Northampton, and how might it anticipate wider cultural change?
In the 90s, I was working at Pleasant Street Video. A customer burst in and screamed, he stabbed him. Call the police. I went outside with the cordless phone while dialing 911, and there was a kid writhing on the ground, another kid standing to the left of him. When I say kid, it turned out they were 15 and 16. And then several other kids on the side screaming. And screaming, well, I thought they were saying he stabbed the faggot, which really knocked me for a loop, that they were yelling this. What it turned out they were screaming was the faggot stabbed him. The kid writhing on the ground died. He died of a stab wound to a major artery near his heart. What it revealed to me was, in very stark terms, was our smugness about how tolerant we are or were, thinking nothing like this could happen in our school systems. This doesn't happen in our schools. And then, of course, there was this default in Northampton where everyone said, well, it was Smith Voc, and dismissing it that way. The same stuff was going on here in this building, too. Yeah, it shook me to my core. My kid was turning 12 that week. He was 3 years younger than these guys. That the whole thing just put it in, as I said, in really stark perspective about the fact that I needed to analyze myself what it means, how we can get so caught up in these these kind of absurd silos, and they manifest in a death in a community that was so proud of itself. And at the same time, we were eliminating the LGBTQ program for kids because there wasn't enough interest and we thought we were pretty good at it. So why have this special group that met downtown when everything was hunky-dory here? That had a very profound effect on how I view masculinity, or the concept or notion of masculinity, and anything that deviates from that, and the kind of encultured attitudes that we have that we take for granted are simply as they should be, because it's simply the way we understand the world. My personal reaction was just a lot of kind of reflection, a lot of doubt relative to how we approach, how we deal with gender, sexual identity, how we deal with conflict, where does violence come from, so on and so forth. And because I usually picked and chose from the easy answers before that, now not so much.
In other places, I would hide my vulnerable side. I'd keep everything in, bottled up, and make sure like people didn't know I was going through a tough time. I'd keep a fake smile on, and try to like get through a day until I get home, and then, I'd probably like break down at home. I realized from people here that they'd listen to what your problems are, or if they see you like you're going through a rough time, they'll ask you and say they're there for you. But anywhere else, if you had like issues, you'd pretty much it'd be like survival of the fittest. Like if you're going through something, you got to go through it on your own. And if you don't make it, then that's your problem, that's your fault, You had to be stronger.
Here in Northampton, people are more aware of gender identity and its mobility. People here, whether they accept it or don't like it, are aware of that and are aware of ways of talking about it that, I definitely wasn't.
I don't think that Northampton is more enlightened, not any more enlightened than any other place. It is a place where the conversation is active, but there's a big difference between having the conversation and the conversation resulting in changes.
The negative side is also there's a possibility for developing a closed mind because we presume that we are as evolved as we could possibly be as far as these things go. And so what comes with that is a kind of sanctimony or an arrogance that we're not entitled to.
Being one of the towns that has 5 colleges in it is a huge, huge factor, because that meant that people came to this place who were wanting to push the envelope and question things on campuses where that was very much more acceptable than necessarily in a town. So the town-gown relationship here goes back a long time.
The National Enquirer did an article on Northampton about, oh my God, maybe almost 40 years now. They came to Northampton because of its association with Smith. There were a number of women who were coming out as lesbians who were staying in the community. As a result of that, ABC actually did a 2020 piece on Northampton about Lesbianville, USA. It sent out kind of a message saying that Northampton actually is a place where you can at least survive in relative comfort and a little better security, where you can be out and you can be accepted for who you are. That wasn't always true, but at least it was an advertisement, and as a result, there was a large influx of lesbians and lesbian couples moving to Northampton. Also, as a result, there was a whole generation of same-sex parent relationships and marriages and children who were products of those marriages who grew up in this community, and it became kind of suffused, and it wasn't a phenomenon anymore. That whole shift made for a significant psychic change on how we approach issues relative to gender, relative to sexuality, more importantly, or how we, how we don't have to subscribe to a binary or be locked into a binary to function as a thriving, vital community. The influence of lesbian culture in Northampton actually has had a profound effect on how the subsequent generations have dealt with each other. Being a white male in Northampton, I've been here for 30 some odd years. I came here in large part because of the appeal of a community that was trending more towards a matriarchy instead of a patriarchy. In order to win the trifecta in the United States of America, you're born male, heterosexual, and white, right? I was, so I hit the trifecta. And then everyone else was a subset of that. And so you had white male supremacy, white heterosexual male supremacy, making the terms, making the laws, making the conditions, establishing the base of the culture. So it can't help but infect how we function here in the community. But there's a lot of pushback against that, for the good. And I think there are a lot more introspective males here that I find, white heterosexual males, a little more introspective and trying to figure out where their place is without trying to assert their supremacy. And as I said, sometimes that's already embedded in the language. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. I'm struggling with it in this interview, so it happens.
Activist movements such as women's rights have often created groups and support networks to talk about how socialization impacts those affected. I wanted to know if there are spaces for men to talk about toxic masculinity. This is especially important in a culture where people are shamed for their lack of knowledge. Are there places where men feel comfortable voicing their opinions so they can work through and question their inherited prejudices?
There's no healthy, strong place for white men to talk about where they're at, because you either have to make yourself big and fierce, it feels like, or small and acceptable. And neither of those are really healthy, in my opinion.
There's all kinds of men's groups. The ones that I have participated in and embrace are intended to enable men to enlarge their toolbox so that they have a whole bunch more access to their emotional life, to enable men to share more intimately with each other in deep friendships, to enable men to get the kind of support they need to live their lives more satisfyingly with the women in their lives, to be better parents. I mean, it's comprehensive.
Part of it's just like, wow, I didn't realize until that moment that guy shared that I carry that same kind of attitude about women. It's like unlearning your own inherent belief, which I think is so wired into us, pushes our conditioning to not go there with other men. So we always kid around like guys do at the beginning, and then we drop into a deeper place.
When my son was born with hydrocephalus, and there were 9 brain operations in the first few months, I had to be the strong guy because my wife had just had a baby. Not trying to internalize male, strength, but she really needed me to be strong for her, and we had another child. And one of the times at men's group that I went and lay down, and they gave me a massage for 2 hours, and I cried for 2 hours. I can feel it welling up because I can remember how much that I needed that and how much that was incredibly rewarding to receive it because they were there for me.
Is feminism a place for men? Many within the community would say yes. But do men think they should commit themselves to gender equality? Do they realize that feminism is about dismantling gender roles? These gender norms restrict women's freedom, but they also impact those in power. If men become feminists, they can question their susceptibility to violence they commit and experience.
I don't think we can deny that there's a system in place, not just in this country, but globally. The culture of humanity right now is structured so that men have the power, women have less of it. And where women have power are areas where men have no interest or have professed no interest. Feminism, I think, is opposing that structure. That structure will not change unless those in power are overthrown or give it up. They're not going to be overthrown because it's not something you can point to. It's not a government where you can vote out the president. It's not, some other dictatorship where you can assassinate them. You can't have a cultural revolution and remove the aristocracy that is men. So they're going to have to give it up. And the main reason why that is so hard and so not happening is who wants to give up their power? What role do men have in feminism? They're the missing factor. It's hard just to recognize that I have that power. I mean, like intellectually, yes. But then to look at like examples in my life when I have exerted that power, and I have, those are embarrassing, shameful stories to even look at, much less tell, much less acknowledge, much less offer restitution for.
I think that if people really want to win, if your idea of winning is equality and tolerance, then you're going to have to find a way to walk white men off the cliff while they still feel powerful, like without taking their power, and with giving them some empathy, which is hard to wrap your head around. It's hard to wrap your head around that white men need empathy, but they do. And if you actually look at the situation, you can see why they might. Because from their point of view, everyone else is gaining in power and they're losing in power. And even if you have too much power, to lose power is to be depressed. And even if you have a little power, to gain power is to be happy. And so I think that it's actually, like, it depends what your goal is. But if your goal is really to create a peaceable kingdom, then it's going to take a huge amount of imagination and empathy and compassion for white men to come off the ledge, for the angry white men to come off the ledge.
I guess first and foremost for me is the idea of paying attention to what's going on for other people who are not male, who are not white, who are not privileged, who are not heterosexual, of which I am in all those categories. So the idea of learning about, paying attention, reading about, interacting with, it's been a huge value of mine to have friendships across those lines.
There is a role for men in this, of course. In fact, oftentimes the silent majority is more likely to be convinced by someone who's from the dominant group speaking out against, say a man speaking out against violence against women, because they don't think that that guy has anything to gain by it, so they trust it more. So definitely men have a role in combating this toxic form of masculinity.
So what does masculinity look like? Does it have a definition once we eradicate those gender roles? What do men think masculinity means, and what do they want it to become? How do they envision the future of masculinity?
The way people see, I guess, men is that they have to be the strong people. Like they got to be the backbone of pretty much everything. They got to like hold everybody up, or they got to like be the man of the house, and they got to show their strength instead of the weakness. Because if they show their weakness, then everybody else is going to feel weak, because what happens when the strong guy of the family is feeling weak, then nobody else has a shoulder to lean on.
I don't think about constructing my identity in terms of manhood. A lot of times when I do think about it, it is in relation to other people.
Even if the question of masculinity feels like it's being questioned, whether it's okay to be masculine, and that gets to your other questions about, well, what is masculinity? I don't know. I couldn't tell you what masculinity is. I can tell you how it might feel, but I could never put it in words, what that means to be masculine. I know what it means to be a father, which is to protect my kids, to protect them. And a teacher, too. I feel like my main job is to protect my students and to give them space. And so in some ways, I see the better part of my masculinity is being able to create space. When I'm proud of myself as a man, then I think of myself as someone who's creating safety for other people.
In terms of my own definition of maleness, I've walked away from a lot of it, the traditional definition. I've really rejected it, left it behind. And in the redefining of it for myself, I've tried to embrace being female. I've tried to embrace being gay. I've tried to embrace being a black person, in the sense that I want all those identities to resonate in me. I want to understand them. I want to appreciate them. I want to value them. And I think that's a big way of rejecting the traditional male patriarchal white supremacy role. So these are all ways in which I'm saying maleness has really, I guess it does take a back seat to my sense of my humanness. The maleness has really receded, especially as defined traditionally.
When you called me originally to say that you were doing a documentary on masculinity or perceptions of masculinity, and I've been thinking about it, and I still don't know what that means. I mean, and maybe that's good, because I mean, there used to be, you know, what, snips and snails and puppy dog tails type of ideas of what being a male was, and sugar and spice and everything nice, what everything a female was. And you think about that, and what the hell does that mean? None of that means anything. It doesn't have any relevance. So, I mean, I think I present clearly about as butch as you get. I have the benefit of also being large. People approach me and deal with me in a completely different way. I provoke certain responses that I have to be conscientious of when I'm talking with someone. I honestly think that confusion is actually a good thing on some part, because I think to have really sharply defined terms like masculinity and femininity, a binary, if you will, it misses an awful lot of what the human experience is.
I don't want to say I don't know, because that just reinstates. I think the first part is the second. Like I said, the second you say you're a man, I'm gonna use whatever pronouns you want. But I think being a man is just first saying you're a dude and acknowledging that, and then working on your appearance if that's a part of it. But it really doesn't have to be, because your appearance can be whatever you want. I mean, I guess it really boils down to like being a man and just respecting women and being kind, which is for everybody, and being in touch with your feelings, even though that's seen as a feminine thing. Never really thought about what it means to be a man, because I've never been asked.
I wish it wasn't hooked to a gender. It shouldn't be hooked to a gender. They're human attributes. And to be really whole, I think it requires both the feminine and the masculine within each person to be as close to unified as we can get. And then you become a whole person.
My work is really about helping to expand those definitions, while also helping folks make choices about which parts work for them and which parts work for our culture.
Or all this talk about male and female is okay, but it's actually missing the point, which is that there isn't any difference between male and female. So I believe that men and women are exactly the same. We appear to be different because everything in the universe needs to pretend to have a duality. Therefore, everything that has been created by the universe grew out of this need for the universe to pretend to have a duality, a split, a right, left, black, white, right, wrong, on, off, male, female duality. What you're doing is very important and good, but in some ways if you're not getting to the core of it, which is that there is no separation, then you're wasting your time. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But you're making money and you're getting creds for it. So in some ways, you are part of the problem. This whole interview is part of the problem. You're reinforcing this delusion of separateness. Yeah. So sorry, but
No.
Yeah.
I run the feminist collective at our school, and what I've been noticing is there's no guys there. And
goofy.
When I'm talking about like women's rights, it doesn't.
You get so laid if you join that club. Sorry.
What am I doing right now, or what am I striving for? Those are very different.
Then you can answer both of them.
One of them is hard to answer, and one of them is terrifying to answer. I know what to strive for. It's a big gap between knowing that and getting there. I think that's the challenge faced by feminism, is the steps it takes to get there are not insurmountable, but they are substantial. The model of masculinity and manhood that matches what I wish it was is womanhood. All the things that they embody are the things that we're missing. The things that are totally acceptable and encouraged in being a woman are what's missing from being a man and what's accepted to be a man. If I'm speaking to men watching this, you're probably a good guy. You almost certainly think you're a good guy. You have to get over that. Because you can still be a good guy and treat other people terribly. And as long as you hold on to the, but I'm a good guy, that's a way to avoid the thing you're afraid of. I know, because I did this yesterday. I argued how what I was doing was enough, that I was a good guy and I didn't have to do more. And the only result it had was it hurt the people that I was arguing with. Entertain the possibility that you could do more, and do it now.